Hey everyone, welcome back to City Skylines and to Douglas. My name is James, and in today's episode we're going to tackle our first big park, which will form part of our equivalent to DC's National Mall. I'll also show you how you can use small parks to boost land value across your city. First, let's recap. I've put chapters on this video, by the way, so if you don't want to watch the recap, feel free to skip ahead. So in the last video, I introduced the series, I gave a quick tour of our starter town, which you see here, and I dealt with some power grid problems. To recap in case you missed that episode, we're building an American city heavily inspired by Washington, D.C. and the surrounding area. Right now, our temporal setting is somewhere in the 1920s or 1930s, as you can see from these lovely vintage vehicles here. And that's what I'm calling Phase 1 of the series. Our goal in this phase is to build up the core of the city with dense, walkable neighborhoods with good access to transit and jobs. So off-camera between episodes, I filled in the road network between the railroad tracks here and the coastline, adding some housing near the waterfront and giving our industrial area, which is very small at the moment, room to expand in the future. And this neighborhood is not in a building theme right now because I intend to fully replace these single-family homes with high-density row houses once we unlock that ability. So on stream last Thursday, we started off by expanding the street grid over here on the western side of the city. And I wanted to introduce a little bit of irregularity and imperfection to the grid here, and I think it's shaping up well. We extended the streetcar line into this neighborhood with 2 new stops, one here and one down here, and we put down a new larger elementary school to keep up with education demand. We also upscaled our power capacity significantly and were able to get rid of those wind turbines thanks to this excellent coal power plant asset that I got off the Steam Workshop. This gives us almost 200 megawatts of power and should hopefully last us until we transition to nuclear power later on. And it has these fantastic cooling towers. So on a related note, I happened to stumble across this odd non-Euclidean pond over here, which, as you can see, it doesn't overflow. And our city engineers can't quite figure out why that is, but they made great use of it by pumping raw sewage into it. So you may find that a little bit cheaty, but I promise we're only going to use that until the city gets big enough to warrant a proper water treatment plant. And finally, as per request of one of the folks in Twitch chat, we established this exquisite island residence over here, which unfortunately is unoccupied at the moment. This is called 1 Mile Island House. That was the name requested for that. And as you can see, it's only connected by a pedestrian tunnel to the mainland, as sort of an experiment on how we might be able to set up car-free areas in the future. However, there are some issues with service vehicles being able to reach it, which I believe is why it's unoccupied. So I'll need to see what I can figure out regarding that. And this sort of less serious stuff is what tends to happen on stream. So again, feel free to tune in if you're into that, or if you want something named after you. The link to the streams is in the description, by the way. My streams are on Twitch, not on YouTube, so you won't see a notification or anything pop up here. We're starting things off today with the big park. First things first, we'll need to get rid of this railroad track as it's in the way. We'll put it back in later as a tunnel once we unlock railroads at 9,000 population. Now to clean up this sad little nub of a park. I'm using the mod Prop Line tool to create these nice rows of trees. You'll see me use this mod a lot in this episode in particular. I'm not going to do too much with this block for now, other than fix up the paths like you see me doing here and add some trees later. Of course, we can always come back in and add more buildings, but the main purpose of this block is really just to provide a connection between the big park and the neighborhood and to this roundabout, which will be a major transit hub. Speaking of the larger park, it's time to expand the park district all the way out to the river. I'm calling this area the East Mall since it will have a counterpart later on the other side of the river. And the 2 paths together will form sort of a rectangle. So we will have some streets running through this area, although we'll be keeping them relatively narrow. And today we'll focus on filling in a couple of the large blocks that are created here, although a couple will be left available for museums or other large monuments or civic buildings later on. I'm also leaving the area a bit open-ended, so we have plenty of room to reconfigure to fit in larger buildings if we need to. Along the river, we'll put in a multi-use path. I've always been annoyed how the vanilla game only has separate paths for walking and biking, so I found this path network on the workshop that has space for both modes. I do want to continue this path up and down the river once we can, but as you can see we run into the edge of the tile, so for now I'm just looping it back to the south end of the mall. In this first block, we're adding a small parking lot and a tennis court complex. You can see in the adjacent block I'm starting to set up a path grid, and I've put down some park buildings from the Parklife DLC. One of those buildings, which I've never actually used before, is the Park Maintenance Building. This is a city service building that, as the name suggests, keeps your parks clean and operational. And I'm not sure if where I'm putting it now is going to be where it stays, as we may want to use that space for something else later on. For now though, I think it makes sense to put it in what will most likely be the city's largest park. So I mentioned museums earlier, and you're probably thinking, duh, the Smithsonian. And while yes, I am trying to evoke the form and feel of the National Mall, and thus the Smithsonian institutions, DC is far from the only city we can pull ideas from. Cities all over the place combine large parks and museums to create powerful focal points of activity. You've got Central Park in New York City with the MoMA and American Museum of Natural History. There's Grant Park in Chicago with the Art Institute and the Field Museum. And even the Louvre in Paris fits the bill. Parks and museums just seem to go together. One idea I am taking from the Smithsonian, though, is the free admission. In City Skylines, with the Parklife DLC, you're able to charge admission for any park that has one of these main gates. And while I think it would make sense to do that if we build an amusement park or a nature reserve, for any regular parks we build, I'm gonna set the admission fee to 0. While moving the park entrances, I noticed that those trees I placed along Pennsylvania Avenue earlier seem to have disappeared. I'm not entirely sure how that happened, but it's easy enough to replace them. With our street layout complete, it's time to upgrade these dirt roads to something a little bit nicer. Throughout the city where I can, I'm using the Big Urban Roads pack from the Steam Workshop. These roads are great for American-style cities. They have the yellow lines, and they even put the streetlights on the correct side of the intersection. And thanks to texture sharing, they don't actually use a ton of resources. Unfortunately, the Big Roads pack doesn't currently have a ton of options for roads with street trees or bike lanes, which I guess is unfortunately pretty accurate to most US cities and towns. Of course, since we're taking a bit of a different track here in Douglas, you'll see me using some vanilla roads and other workshop roads in certain places, particularly for those bike networks, which will be coming in force later on. Here on our mall, I'm using one-way roads on the long axis, and to be honest, I don't really know what my reasoning was. I suppose it may help with traffic flow once we have a lot of tourists here. And it's at this point that I realized I really should have waited to place all of these paths, since as you can see I'm having to delete and replace most of them. Now for some gravel paths through what will be the open area of the East Mall. In our real-life inspiration, this stretch of the National Mall gives unobstructed views of the Capitol building at one end and the Washington Monument at the other. It's also used for events and gatherings like the inauguration. And I like to think that this area of our park will serve a similar purpose, although it's a little bit smaller than its real-life counterpart, and I think we'll definitely want to get some monuments to place at the ends. I am a little hesitant on just grabbing, for example, an asset of the Capitol building, even though I'm pretty sure there is one in the workshop. Because while we are taking inspiration from a real city, I do want this city to be a mix of cities, and to not have buildings that are super easily recognizable as being from one specific city. Just as I'm finishing up with the trees on the east mall, the park levels up. That unlocks a few more buildings, including this neat chessboard plaza, which I think I'll just slap down right here in what's become the entrance block of our park. In my opinion, one of the easiest ways to spruce up your parks and city skylines is to literally do just that, place trees. Here I'm again using the MVP of this episode, Prop Line Tool, to line these paths with trees and make the space feel a little bit more self-contained. Leaving the big park for a moment, let's jump to a few other areas around Douglas and create some smaller neighborhood parks. Firstly, we're here at the new elementary school. This asset is pretty bare bones, so I'm adding some narrow sidewalks to connect to the various entrances. You see me using a mod called Move It. It's one of my favorites, even though sometimes it can be a little frustrating to actually grab the thing you're trying to move. And one thing I really want to stress in Douglas is the concept of providing walkable and bikeable routes to schools. Of course, in our current setting in the 1920s, this was the default. Nobody drove their kids to school like you'd see nowadays across the US. Cars were slow enough and few enough that streets were still safe for pedestrians and cyclists. And it's a little unfortunate that City Skylines makes it a little bit difficult to show this. I've kind of been operating in a headcanon that anywhere you see me put down a cobblestone or gravel road, that space is implicitly shared between cars and people, even if the game doesn't strictly simulate that. Now let's jump down to this odd trapezoidal block here. I'm starting to learn my lesson, and I'm upgrading the roads before putting down any paths. It's definitely something to keep in mind when you're using road anarchy, to upgrade your roads first, and then place down your pedestrian paths or other props. Anyway, this little park is kind of an experiment. You'll notice it doesn't have a park gate or any other park buildings. Instead, I'm just using paths, and later we'll add some props to fill in the area. This is about the limit of detailing that I do, since it can be quite a time sink and I don't really want to deal with downloading a ton of custom props for parks. I'm actually just using vanilla assets here that you can find on the Park tab if you have the Parklife DLC. And it turns out that this park didn't really work as an actual park. Even though it's a park district, I think you need a building of some kind to generate visitors and to boost the leisure rating of the surrounding area. So I think what we'll have to come back and do is replace that little pavilion with a proper gazebo building, and then it should actually function as a park. The lore of this little park is this giant tree right here. I'm imagining that sometime in the early history of the city, maybe back when this was farmland, there was a giant tree planted here, and as the city grew, they didn't want to cut down that tree. So instead, there's this tiny little park to memorialize it. Now looking at land value here, you can see the effect in the center of the city, where the highest concentration of parks is. There's also an positive effect on land value. Our next neighborhood park is going just to the east of Old Main Street, through the middle of a wide block that I hadn't really been sure what to do with. You can see that immediately as I put down this park district, the leisure rating jumps significantly, as there's already a park building here in the form of the basketball court. We do have enough space to add gates on either end, and to create a winding path down the middle of the park. This area is a little cramped, but we're able to squeeze in an info booth, a cafe, and a small Japanese garden. I can see Sims using the path through this park maybe on their way to work, or to get to restaurants or go shopping in the evenings and on weekends. Our final neighborhood park is the waterfront area at the east edge of the city. Sort of by accident, I found that the Parklife DLC Nature Reserve path makes a really nice boardwalk. I don't think it makes a ton of sense to have a beach here, and the bare ground texture looks pretty lackluster, so I'm going with rocks to form the shoreline here. These are again just vanilla assets, although I believe some of them, particularly these massive ones that I'm not using, are from the Parklife DLC. Adding some rocks and vegetation totally transforms the area, and I'm really happy with how it turns out. I was also kind of surprised by the immediate effect on the houses nearby. Coastlines and city skylines already give boosted land value, so adding a park to one is a super easy way to level up a neighborhood quickly. Okay, so now we've reached my favorite part of today's episode. If I had to give one piece of advice on how to make your cities feel organically placed in their environment, it's to absolutely pack the surroundings with trees. So to the tune of an absolute banger from SimCity 4, let's plop some trees. I very much look forward to doing some more of that as we unlock more tiles. But back on the East Mall, we're filling in this block with the Botanical Garden. This is a vanilla park building and I'm always impressed by how versatile it is. I'm starting off this block by adding some gravel paths and some flower beds along the front. A botanical garden is a place where trees, flowers, and other plants from around the world are cultivated and displayed, so I want to give the area a variety of tree types and some color as well. I do wish I had waited until daytime to start on this, as night is quickly approaching and it's becoming harder to see. At this point, it became too dark to keep working on the botanical garden, so I hopped over to the downtown area to try to fix up some of this rush hour traffic with asymmetrical roads. As I was working on that, I noticed we were getting really close to the 6,500 population mark. And there it is, we've achieved Big Town. This unlocks some really important things for us going forward, and the first thing we'll take advantage of is that new area. We're also able to unlock high-density residential zones, which will be the focus of the next episode. And we've also got things like the incineration plant and the university, which we'll be using soon as our landfills are especially starting to become a problem. Also, we have access to a new larger elementary school, which should help us as we start putting down those high-density zones. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and buy this tile that'll let us do the other side of the park, as well as expand the city in that direction. You may be wondering how this park will fit into the rest of Douglas. This will make more sense once I can show you in the next episode, but the edges of the east and west mall will form a rectangle that's offset from our street grid. The roads along those edges will then continue as diagonal avenues out into the rest of the city. And while the rectangle formed by the mall will definitely be a focal point of the city, I don't actually want it to be the definitive center, so to speak. I've always liked the idea of multipolar cities. That is, cities that have many different focal points of activity for jobs, recreation, education, or whatever. For example, in hopefully a couple of episodes, we'll be putting together Douglas's central train station, which will be another focal point or pole of the city. And in doing this, we are diverging a little bit from the typical American model. In DC, for example, the National Mall was, from its very first iteration in the LaFont plan, explicitly the central point of the entire district. In other words, while we're leaning heavily on the form of the National Mall, the hard rectangular edges and the open center, we're shifting away from its function as the definitive singular center of the city. Anyway, back to the Botanical Garden, we are just finishing up by adding some final trees and bamboo along the edge. You'll notice I've surrounded the building itself with these pink and purple trees. The game simply calls them flower trees, but I'm taking that to mean cherry blossom trees, like the ones Washington, D.C. is famous for in the springtime. After wrapping up the Botanical Garden, I'm finishing up today's episode with a little tree work in the same part of the park we started off in. This time, however, I'm being careful not to touch the trees along the road. All in all, I'm really happy with the progress we made today. I think the East Mall is shaping up nicely, and the smaller neighborhood parks we worked on will be a big help in leveling up the high-density residential areas we'll be working on next episode. Let me know what you thought of the episode today. This style, with mostly time lapses and voiceovers, is pretty new to me, and I'm still experimenting with it. I'm also aiming for roughly bi-weekly episodes, so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, thanks everybody for tuning in and sticking around to the end. I really appreciate it. My name is James, and I'll catch you all in the next episode.